Hello, and welcome back to Paint and Prose. As mentioned previously, today we are going to be talking about my first book, A House of Cards, and the structure of a novel. I'm using the same canvas and paint, Artist Loft, from the last video. For the background color, I'm using a pre-mixed color called Naples Yellow, which is as good a match for the background of the book I could hope to get. Originally, the plan was to paint the actual cover of the book, but I decided to take a different direction for this paint. Since the color I'm using right now is pre-mixed, I can get pretty generous with its application without worrying about running out. So we're going to coat the canvas really nicely. Now that we've got the painting started, let's get to the book. A House of Cards, published in 2011, takes place in 1969 and follows the life of Tracy Burrows, a young woman who leaves her home in a fictionalized version of Huntsville, Alabama called Bakersfield, to attend school at one of the nation's most prestigious universities, Harvard, during a time when America was in the middle of huge transformations. You have the civil rights movement, the student movement, the women's movement, the Chicano movement, all of these voices standing up and demanding to be heard, and then this character, Tracy, who only wants to get her law degree, following in the footsteps of the likes of Thurgood Marshall and W.E.B. Du Bois. She quickly learns, however, that during revolutionary times, being yourself and refusing to be swayed from your foundations can be its own revolution. If you watched my previous video on my journey, you know that A House of Cards started out as a bigger novel until Death Do Us Part, until it was broken down into 3 different novels. A House of Cards was a purposely intentioned book, but it wasn't always. I started writing Until Death when I was 16 years old, after having a dream where I ran into a guy from my past, let's call him Derek, at an arts festival 10 years after we had last spoken. Dream me, like real me, had the single-minded focus of going to Harvard and attending law school, and it was in pursuit of those goals that Dream me and Derek stopped talking. As the conversation between us progresses, things get more and more painful as Dream Me realizes just how far from those goals I landed. When Dream Me's husband, we'll call him Kurt, reappears, all hell breaks loose. Think of a confrontation between Atlas Corrigan and Ryle Kincaid, a la It Ends With Us. Okay, so now we have our base color. It's all dry. I wanted to show you this. I don't know how well I'll be able to capture it on film, but there is a whole painting underneath here already done. If you put light to it, you can see it. I repainted over it. I did a couple of coats, and the purpose behind that is Tracy is a history/political science major, and so she understands that history means everything. Normally I mask, but I decided not to mask this one, so you can see that it already has a little design on it. The idea was to trace it onto here, but I couldn't get that to work. So this is actually drawn freestyle, which I am not an artist, and I've never been able to draw. So the fact that I was able to do that is actually pretty impressive, at least to me anyway. I'm going to do a burnt sienna as my outline for most, but not all. And for it, I'll be using my finest brush. After bouncing around with ways to tell the story, I finally settled on this. The prologue with that dream scene, then alternating flashbacks between Derek and Kurt, the 2 love interests, until we make it to the present. I wasn't too thrilled about it, but I weaved the story together and one day woke up and decided it was done. Picture, it's 2009. I was a year out of college. I had just finished my book, and desperate to get feedback, I let a person who I thought was a good friend borrow my jump drive so she could read it. She opened a 2-year-old file, read that, thought the book was terrible, showed it to her brother, who also thought the book was terrible, and then her brother called me and told me everything that was wrong with what I had written. Even worse, that brother told his friend, who I may or may not have had a crush on, that I wrote a bad book about him. Of course, the devastating part was not the guy being told I wrote a book about him, because I didn't. It was the idea of me being a bad writer, because by this time I had already fashioned myself as an author and had writing credentials to my name that pointed to the fact that I might be a good one. One of the friend's brother's critiques was that I didn't even talk about the historical events that happened during the time of the novel. Although he hadn't read the real story, the current one, the one I deemed finished, it was a valid point. Initially, the book was set in 2004, but the more that I listened to Tracy's voice, that her story belonged in the past. So I started with the strongest part of the story that I had, Tracy in college, and I worked from there. Since I had already written Until Death, I knew that there were at least 3 parts of the story that I wanted to tell, and I kind of simultaneously worked on them. The original name I came up with for the novel was A Disaster: Lessons in Obligation and Social Responsibility. The idea was to have a kind of War and Peace, Pride and Prejudice style of naming it, but everyone, including the editor, hated that name, so it got scrapped. After a while, I landed on A House of Cards. I chose the name because during the days when Tracy was born, a house with a white picket fence was the pinnacle of what women were supposed to want. Since that was the last thing Tracy ever desired, I wanted to subvert that notion. She gets the house, but it's built on a shaky foundation, and as Maren Morris lets us know in the song The Bones, the house won't fall if the bones are good. But as Tracy realizes, relationships, good and bad, need some sort of solid structure to survive. Otherwise, you're merely stacking up cards against the wind. Once I settled on A House of Cards as the title, I wanted to make sure that the book, as well as the other two, had a theme that you could see at play throughout the novel. Since I had already made a play on the house part, I wanted something to connect to the cards, even if it was just like an Easter egg kind of deal. The chapters of the book are supposed to evoke life lessons in connection to the original title, but the sections of the book are tied to the cards part of the title. To that end, A House of Cards is divided into 6 parts: the shuffle, the deal, the flop, the turn, the river, and final acts. Love is a gamble. So I turned the book into a game of Texas Hold'em. Alright, and now we're going to want to even the color out so it looks more uniform across the board. We're going to let it dry, and then we're going to try to get a nice light green. The strokes don't need to be all that uniform because this is going to be grass. And then we're going to also layer some colors on here too. To get the color green that I used the Hooker's green. I mixed it with yellow and what was left of the titanium white from our structure. But let's talk about how Texas Hold'em breaks down in the novel. First, the shuffle. The shuffle is essentially the prologue of the novel. A few days before classes are supposed to start, Tracy finds herself unable to sleep. She's attempting to hype herself up and not think about the relationship that just ended. This is the reader's first chance to get to know the main character, to kind of get into her head. She lists out her goals and plans for the upcoming school year in a kind of methodical way. Like a shuffle, it's supposed to be quick and gives you brief snatches of the main character, but no full picture. The deal. This is the part of the book where you learn more about Tracy. It focuses on the setup of the novel. You get introduced to most, if not all, of the major characters. You see what hand she has to play with. She's the child of a single mother, a black woman from the South, a scholarship student with limited funds. She gave up a relationship for her education, and she plans to focus on that despite the parties in her life that seem interested in her, including Kurt Andrews, a quiet, wealthy, Southern gentleman enrolled in Harvard Law and who just so happens to be from the same town in Alabama that Tracy is. The flop. The first chapter in this section is appropriately titled Risk Assessments. In a game of Texas Hold'em, the flop is where you see the playing field for the first time. Yes, you've already gotten your 2 cards, but the flop is where you get to see how they play against the board. When I was envisioning the novel, I pictured Tracy being dealt a bad hand, but with the determination to make it work. The flop gives Tracy elements that she can work within to make the best use of her hand because her personality and her sheer determination will not let her fold. She only has this one hand to make work. She's not going to waste it. I'm going to use the remainder of this color on a couple of the areas. So I'm going to put it right here and put some over here. And the purpose is just to add texture and layer to the painting. Then comes the turn. For the sake of not spoiling the novel for anyone who hasn't read it, and I want you to go out and read it, and I've provided an Amazon link in the description, I will say this. I was very deliberate in both how the book is set up and in the naming of the sections. The chapter title for the first chapter in this section is named Flight Risk. In poker, there is a round of betting before each reveal. You can bet once you receive your cards, you can bet after the flop, after the turn, and after the river. Even if you do not have a large pot, as long as betting doesn't get too high, you can stay in a hand for long enough for your hand to become better. You're trying to make the best 5-card hand out of 7 cards, the 2 in your hand and the 5 in the community. The more of those 7 cards you see, the better your chances of having a good hand. Sometimes all it takes is 1 card to make a great hand. The trick, though, is in getting to see all the cards. Betting restricts who can and can't see the hand. When I was taught how to play, I was told that betting is paying for that information. A person who sees 4 cards into a straight or a flush, or maybe even just 2 pair, may bet on the chance that the cards they need will show up. A player who might match a large bet to see the flop might get discouraged by what turns up and will only stay in the hand if no one bets or the bet stays low enough. There is a term in poker called being pot committed, and that's the point where you have invested so much into the hand, you're in it for the long haul. And players that are still in the game by the turn are likely to finish the hand, whether it's a win or a loss, because they are committed to it. As it goes in poker, so it goes in the novel. By the turn, each character has invested so much into the game that they cannot conceivably pull out, and at this point are simply waiting for the final card to drop. The next and second to last section of the novel is the river. This is the point where all the cards are on the table. You know exactly what you're working with. You've made a decision in a previous round whether you're going to stay in the hand or not. In relationships, we often reveal ourselves in sections. We don't dump all our faults onto the table on the first date, they're revealed piece by piece. For the characters Tracy and Kurt, they are seeing each other, truly seeing each other for the very first time. There's no more secrets, just the game to be played. A quick paint break. I used the leftover color from the path to make the first underlayer for our trees. The darker color on top is the lamp black and burnt umber. I'm going to save some of this color so I can mix it with green when it's time to do our undercoats for the leaves. The last section of the book is called Final Acts. In poker, this would be the reveal stage or showdown. This is where the last bets are made. This is where cards have to be turned over. There's no more bluffing or blustering. This is the decision stage for both poker and the novel. One of the things that I hate about poker is that the best hand doesn't always win. Often it doesn't win. The person with the most resources gets the most looks. Being a person with a small pot means that you end up folding hands that would have won should you have had the money to play. I wanted to bring this up in the last video about the parable of talents and because of time. But if you've ever wondered why people make the choices that they do, sometimes it just comes down to the resources that they have to work with. In Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the basic needs have to be met first before psychological needs can even be addressed. Love and belonging only come after someone is fed and feels safe, and esteem is only achieved once those needs have been fulfilled. We're all dealt a hand at birth, and as easy as it is to say it's all about what you do with it, the truth is that those who are born with 5 times more resources get to look at 5 times more hands, which allows them the space to make mistakes. The big pot always has the most leverage. What I'm doing, and you probably can't see with any great detail, is making the tops and the bottoms of the pillars. And I'm learning that I need finer paintbrushes for this. So now that we have finished talking about my book, let's talk about how you structure your book. First things first. Writing a book is a craft, and like all crafts, it requires study and practice in order for us to become better writers. Repetition is the key. Just like the odds of an artist laying down a perfect track the first time they record it is pretty slim, your first works are not likely to be masterpieces, but that's okay. Think about a video game. No one rescues the princess on the first run through of Mario Brothers. You get close, you get hit with the turtle shell, you start back over. This is how you should be with writing. This is how you should look at your writing. In order for you to become better at your writing craft, you have to have the right tools. Of craft, when it comes to writing, Matthew Salesses, author of Craft in the Real World, says that you must first understand the rules of craft in order to challenge those rules. In other words, you must first have a proper foundation beneath your feet if you want to build a steady structure, which is, coincidentally, one of the things of a house of cards. So, for the sake of a thought experiment, let's pretend you've never written anything before and you're starting your very first ever writing activity. Just how engines can be assembled differently but have certain elements that are the same, so does literature. The basic structures of your book is likely to have these 7 elements: character, plot, setting, theme, point of view, conflict, and tone. So let's break those down. Character. Who will be the persons that carries your narrative? Who is telling the story? What drives them? Your main character acts as the audience's surrogate. They are often the most important character of the novel. In a character driven novel, the plot becomes secondhand to the journey of the characters. I believe strong characters make strong books. So when I develop characters, I like to know who I am working with. Tommy Orange's There is an example of a character driven novel. Some tips to get you to know your character a little better. Fill out a job application as your character. Create a dating profile as your character. Describe your character to someone as if you were describing a real person. Setting. Where and when does your book take place? Does your book take place in a real place or did you completely make it up? In Charles Dickinson's David Copperfield, in the first paragraph, you find that the character was born on a Friday at 12 o'clock. Within the next couple of paragraphs, we learn that the beginning of the novel further takes place in Blunderstone in Suffolk in March. You don't necessarily have to spell out the setting of your novel. You don't have to begin with it was a dark and stormy night on October 5th, 1985. But the better the image of the setting in your mind, the better you can convey to your audience. Basically, the more you know about your book, the better you can write it. The setting of A House of Cards, for example, takes place in Boston, Massachusetts in 1969. Theme. The theme is the central topic, subject, or message within a narrative. In my earlier review of Butler's Parable series, we went over theme extensively and we talked about theme earlier with my novel. Simply, the theme is what the work is about. What are you trying to express in your novel? How do you go about doing that? The major themes that I like to pull out of A House of Cards is that one, love is a gamble. Two, being yourself is its own sort of revolution. Point of view. Point of view refers to the voice that the narrative of the novel is being told in. There are 4 points of view. First person, I, me, such as you'll find in David Copperfield, or like my book, A House of Cards. Second person, you. This medium is used more frequently in short stories, but can be used in a novel. Appropriately named the TV series You on Netflix is told in this point of view, which with the you being, in this case, Bex, but it can also be a generic you as in the audience. Third person is she, he, it, they. Alice Walker's Temple of My Familiar is written from this point of view. This is often the most common point of view as well. Fourth person, we, us, are. This is not commonly used in novel writing. When I was looking for an example, the closest I could come up with was Anne Rand's Anthem, fourth person point of view, or it could also be considered first person plural. Side note, you can mix point of views in your story. The pilot season that I mentioned earlier is written in first and third person point of view, depending on the chapter. Conflict. Conflict in a story is a major element of dramatic structure that creates challenge for the characters to struggle through. This is the drama that is essential to reality television or the series of actions and counteractions that test your characters throughout the novel. The main types of conflict are person versus self, person versus person, person versus society, person versus nature, person versus technology, person versus supernatural, and person versus fate. Greek mythology is rife with examples of person versus fate. My favorite is King Acrisius. He didn't have a boy child, so he goes to the Oracle of Delphi to find out why, and finds out that he will be killed one day by his daughter Danae's son. To attempt to escape that fate, he imprisons his daughter, who is then visited by Zeus in the form of a golden shower. After Acrisius finds out that she's pregnant, he locks her in a chest and throws her in the sea. She's rescued. Perseus is born. He has this long hero's journey. Then, way into the future, the kid enters into a discus competition where he randomly kills an audience member who turns out to be King Acrisius. Kid didn't even know it was his grandfather. This is what I love about Greek mythology, is that you can't escape your fate. The House of Cards, the main conflict is person versus person, and also person versus self. An update on where we are with the painting. We just added the last of our branches and we'll add more branches as needed. Now we're going to do leaves. And we're just going to put leaves everywhere. We want our undercoat to be this dark color and we're going to add light color the further along we get. I'm using the last of the green and the black and the burnt umber left over from the making of the bark of the tree to mix with the leaves. We want the first coat to be dark because we want it to be our underlayer, and then we're just going to make happy little trees. Next, you have tone. Oregon State College of Liberal Arts defines tone as the attitude that a character or narrator or author takes towards a given subject. Different genres tend to rely on different tones to set their book. In a thriller, there is an expectation of suspense and tension. In romance, the tone is more likely to be light, possibly angsty. In Coates' Between the World and Me, the tone of the novel is critical, direct, analytical, and poetic. It is a letter to his son and his fears for the future his son will face. Tone is going to be how you present your story to the audience. So, what tone are you trying to set in your book? Whenever an adult in my life thought I was being cheeky, they would warn, watch your tone. That is the advice I want to leave you with on this subject. Watch your tone in your writing. Informative can become preachy, high energy can easily slip into hyperactive. Make sure that your book is telling your audience what you accurately want it to say. And here I just put some water into what remains of my green mixture, the dark one, and I'm just going to pat it on. So it's just a lighter version of the green that we just did. Just putting water in the same mixture, make it a little bit lighter. And then finally, there's plot. I left plot for last so I could talk about it a little bit more. The plot of a story is a series of events describing how the book's characters face obstacles. It's likely that if you've ever taken an English class, you've seen this chart. This is the plot structure diagram, where you have the exposition moving into the rising action, a climax, then the falling action, and finally the resolution. This is a basic plot structure, but there is no one plot structure. There are different deviations for how a narrative moves. There's the free tags pyramid, where the introduction moves into the rising action. There's a climax and then a catastrophe. There's the Fichtean curve, where the book stays in crisis during the rising action, climaxes, then has a fallen action. There are many ways to structure your own work, and the more you write, the more you will develop your own modes and methods. Because remember, writing is a craft. Also, remember that the plot is how the action moves along in the novel. Books without well thought out plots tend to be rambling and be hard for your readers to follow along with. And right now, I'm just kind of adding texture to the grass. I'm not trying to do anything special, just adding a little bit of texture. So, this is the very basic boilerplate fundamental elements readers expect to find in a novel, namely because this is how most novels that we come across in Western literature are structured. Yes, there are deviations. No, you are not honor bound to write a book that looks like every other book. For example, Alejandro Zambra's book, Multiple Choice, is a book that doesn't follow the plot structure or contain the seven essential elements. On the cover of the book, there is a square that questions if this book is A, fiction, B, nonfiction, C, poetry, D, all of the above, E, none of the above. It is designed to follow the examples of the Chilean academic altitude test. The reader is given the choice to read it how they choose. However, it is important to note that this was not his first book. He'd already established himself as a writer by the time this book was published, which allows him for more creativity. Similarly, Zola by Isaiah King is another example of a departure from how we expect stories to read. Told in 155 Twitter texts, he used to tell a suspense-laden narrative that is so outrageous you want to keep reading. Zola will go down in the annals of viral tweets that shaped the app, so much so that it is taught in college classes and was made into a movie. Your individual background will also shape how you write. Every culture expresses themselves in different ways. The way you write is an expression of yourself, which is then influenced by the culture that you were raised in or maybe emulate. How that culture tells stories often translates into how you write them. If you've ever heard the expression, all art is propaganda, then you know that art is influenced by the time of the people who are living in it. 85% of books you currently see in print are put out into the world by only 5 major publishing houses. Traditionally, to get published, you have to find an agent, and the agent shops your book to publishers. The problem is that the agents, the publishers, the editors, and buyers are all likely to have very similar background. White, wealthy to middle class, college educated at usually a prestigious college, attended an MFA program, then honed their craft in New York or Los Angeles. This is why there are so many books with characters who are writers and so few books with characters that come from disadvantaged backgrounds. Most art is commissioned, and most people who have money to commission art have wealth. So a lot of the time, it is that worldview that we are seeing reflected onto the pages. Shakespeare was free to write his works because he was a commissioned artist. He was paid to put out his works, and his works reflect the views of his patron. We still talk about his works because since his works were created, learning about them has been part of our collective consciousness. It is considered learned and classy to know Shakespeare because we still study his works. His works influence writers to this day. Go up to someone on a street corner and ask them if they know who Romeo and Juliet are. They will most likely answer yes. In any given year, some reimagined Shakespeare play is sure to grace the big screens. Because he wrote it in 1623, we know about him in 2025, and because we know about him in 2025, future generations will know who he is far into the future. This is why it is important for you to write. Everyone should write, not just because it is an incalculable skill, but because your voice is important to the narrative as a whole. And if you don't write your stories, they can say that you weren't there. Harlem Renaissance writer Zora Neale Hurston says, if you are silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it. If you don't write your narratives, they will silence you and say you never opened your mouth to speak. So you have your tools. Now all that is left is to tie all the elements together, and you're on your way to writing a well thought out, engaging story that allows your voice to be entered into the conversation. So get to writing, and don't forget to visit your local library to pick up a new book to read. That's it for this episode of Paint Prose. If you like what you're seeing, please like and subscribe to the channel. Turn your notifications on so you're up to date on the latest content. I've created a Patreon and a Ko-fi account if you would like to buy me a cup of coffee. To purchase a copy of A House of Cards, you can click on the link below. Until next time, keep your brushes dry, and thank you for watching.